officer strikes him. He's not giving up.
Courtrooms are meant for order and justice, but sometimes they turn into scenes straight out of a movie, like a man trying to escape through the ceiling or someone lighting a joint in front of the judge. Ever wonder how wild things can get in court? Case number 1. Leonid Greiser's failed escape attempt. Imagine sitting in a courtroom, and just as you think you've seen everything, a murder trial turns into something out of a slapstick comedy. That's exactly what happened in Russia when Leonid Greiser, who was on trial for the brutal murder of his sister, Ariana Karol, tried to escape in one of the most bizarre ways possible. Greiser, confined to a glass box for the duration of the trial, was being closely monitored for obvious reasons. After all, he'd confessed to killing his sister and even claimed that Satan had ordered him to do it. His dangerous nature led authorities to keep him in a secure glass enclosure to ensure everyone's safety. But during the trial, Leonid decided he wasn't interested in waiting around for his sentencing. At first, he seemed calm as he spoke briefly with the courtroom guards through a narrow opening in the glass. But then, in what can only be described as a moment of desperation, Greiser suddenly had the brilliant idea to escape. He bent down and tried to squeeze his body through the small opening. Now picture this. He thought he could crawl through feet first, but his head, of course, didn't fit. So he pulled back and gave up, right? Nope. Undeterred, Greiser came up with an even wilder plan. He decided to climb up through the ceiling. Yes, you read that right. He got on the bench inside the glass box and started squeezing his way through the narrow gaps between the ceiling slats. At first, the guards weren't too concerned, probably thinking, there's no way he's getting through that. But as soon as Greiser started pushing aside the styrofoam ceiling tiles and wriggling his way out, the guards sprang into action. In a frantic struggle, guards grabbed his legs and tried to pull him back down, but Greiser wasn't giving up easily. Despite being smacked with a baton, he kept wriggling. At one point, his pants even came off, adding a ridiculous twist to an already absurd escape attempt. Eventually, the guards managed to pull him back into the box, pants and all, putting an end to his ill-fated break for freedom. Case number 2. Diana Lovejoy's dramatic fainting. Diana Lovejoy's courtroom saga is one for the books, not just because of her crime, but because of her dramatic reaction to the guilty verdict. Lovejoy, a former YouTuber who used to share cooking tips and health advice, found herself in court facing serious charges: conspiracy to commit murder and attempted murder. She had plotted to have her soon-to-be ex-husband killed in what was later revealed to be a botched murder-for-hire plan. During her trial, it was clear that tensions were high. Lovejoy's marriage had ended badly, and she allegedly hired her gun instructor, Weldon McDavid Jr., to shoot and kill her ex-husband, Greg Mulvihill. The plot didn't go as planned, and her ex survived, leading to a long and dramatic legal process. Lovejoy, who had once been seen as a wholesome figure online, was suddenly painted as a cold-blooded criminal. The trial was intense, but the real drama came when the verdict was read. After days of testimony and legal battles, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. It was a moment that could have been quietly accepted, but Lovejoy had other plans. As the words "guilty" echoed through the courtroom, her reaction was nothing short of theatrical. She gasped, her eyes widened in shock, and then, in what seemed like an instant, she collapsed backward in her seat, fainting on the spot. The courtroom was thrown into chaos. A guard rushed to her aid, lifting her back into her chair. Lovejoy's eyes were open, but she appeared to be in a catatonic state, her head rolling uncontrollably. Some people in the room were convinced she had genuinely fainted from the shock. Others, including the prosecutor, Jody Breton, suspected it might have been an act, another attempt to manipulate the situation in her favor. After all, if she was willing to plot her husband's murder, what was faking a faint in comparison? Medical professionals on site determined it was just a fainting episode, and Lovejoy eventually regained composure. But the courtroom drama didn't end there. After recovering, she was brought back to hear her sentence: 26 years to life in prison. Despite her dramatic reaction, the outcome remained the same, and Lovejoy's story became a cautionary tale of how far desperation can drive someone. Her fainting fit added an extra layer of tension and disbelief to an already shocking case, leaving everyone to wonder. Was it real or just another part of the act? Case number 3, Keeson Wilkins' over-the-top collapse. Keeson Wilkins' courtroom performance was something you don't see every day. Well, unless you're a judge or guard dealing with a defendant like him. Representing himself in an Ohio courtroom, Wilkins faced serious charges. Multiple counts of assault and weapons violations linked to a shooting in 2004. From the very start, Wilkins seemed intent on causing as much disruption as possible. On the first day of the trial, Wilkins' antics had already gotten the courtroom cleared multiple times. But the real theatrics came on day 2. Things were tense as the hearing got underway, with the prosecution questioning a policeman as a key witness. Wilkins, who was representing himself, had the chance to cross-examine the witness. But instead of taking his legal defense seriously, he decided to make the trial all about him in the most dramatic way possible. As the witness was being questioned, Wilkins suddenly collapsed to the floor. Court deputies rushed over, thinking something was seriously wrong. But here's the catch. Wilkins wasn't having a medical emergency. Medics on site confirmed there was absolutely nothing wrong with him. In fact, he was perfectly healthy. It quickly became clear that this was just an elaborate act, a stunt to delay the trial and create chaos. The judge, who was already familiar with Wilkins' flair for drama, wasn't buying it for a second. Calmly, she asked for the courtroom to be cleared yet again, while medics tried to revive him. Wilkins continued to play his part, slumping in his chair and acting as though he was unconscious. That is, until one of the deputies pulled out a small bottle of smelling salts. Within moments of the pungent smell hitting Wilkins' nose, his head flew back, and he was miraculously revived. Case number 4. Daniel Nicholson's superhuman escape attempt. Daniel Nicholson's day in court turned into absolute chaos when he tried to pull off one of the most dramatic escape attempts you can imagine. Nicholson, who was in court on weapons and driving charges, was also under the influence of methamphetamines. This combination of desperation and drugs pushed him to try something no one in the courtroom was prepared for. It all started when Nicholson realized that his bail was being revoked. He wasn't expecting this. He had hoped to walk out of the courtroom free that day. But instead of sitting down and accepting the decision, Nicholson decided he had other plans. Fueled by meth and panic, he suddenly leapt out of the dock, attempting to scale the glass panel, separating him from the rest of the courtroom. What followed was an all-out struggle between Nicholson and the officers who rushed in to restrain him. As officers grabbed him, Nicholson seemed to gain a kind of superhuman strength. He wrestled with them, flinging his body around and resisting with all his might. Even when they managed to pull him back down into the dock, Nicholson wasn't done. He sprang back up, vaulting over the side of the dock and landing on the courtroom desk in front of him. The scene was pure chaos, with officers and court personnel trying to subdue him while his supporters, who were sitting outside the courtroom, stormed in to add to the madness. One of his supporters was even holding his young son, pleading with the guards to have mercy on Nicholson. Despite the chaos, the officers eventually managed to wrestle Nicholson to the ground and restrain him in handcuffs. The scene left 2 sheriff's officers injured, adding to the seriousness of the situation. And while Nicholson's wild escape attempt may have seemed impressive in the moment, it didn't do him any favors in court. He was sentenced to at least 12 months in jail for the escape attempt, with the judge sternly warning him to grow up and get clean, or he'd be facing much more time behind bars. Case number 5. Christopher Teal slaps his attorney. Christopher Teal's courtroom appearance was already intense, given the charges he was facing, rape and unlawful imprisonment. But what happened during his competency hearing turned it into a moment no one in the room would forget. Teal, who had a history of erratic behavior, was already in a volatile state when he entered the courtroom. The hearing was supposed to determine if he was mentally fit to stand trial, but what happened next left everyone stunned. As Teal stood before the judge with his court-appointed attorney, everything seemed normal, at least for the first few minutes. But without any warning, Teal suddenly turned and slapped his own lawyer. That's right, he just smacked him in front of the entire courtroom. The room froze for a second, with everyone trying to process what had just happened. His attorney, who had been standing next to him, was visibly shocked. The court officers, however, didn't waste a moment. They immediately sprang into action, grabbing Teal and pinning him to the ground. It wasn't easy. Teal was a large man, around 250 pounds. But the officers managed to get control of the situation quickly. They cuffed him and led him out of the courtroom. But that wasn't the end of Teal's outbursts. 2 weeks later, during another hearing, Teal was brought into court strapped into a restraint chair. This time, officers weren't taking any chances. His hands and legs were bound, and just to make sure he didn't cause any more chaos, they placed a spit hood over his head. Yet even in this state, Teal found a way to disrupt the proceedings. During the hearing, he loudly complained about his mugshot, claiming that the photo made his hair look short. He was upset because apparently the mugshot had been taken from his Facebook page. He even asked the court if they had access to Google. Teal's courtroom violence and erratic behavior didn't win him any sympathy. After the hearing, he was found competent to stand trial, and when the trial concluded, he was sentenced to 8.5 years to life in prison for his crimes. His behavior in court, particularly slapping his own attorney, became a symbol of just how out of control he had become. Case number 6. Spencer Boston's joint protest. Spencer Boston's courtroom stunt is one of those moments that left everyone shaking their heads in disbelief. It started out as a simple hearing. Boston was in court for minor marijuana possession charges in Tennessee. Normally, this would be a pretty straightforward case, maybe a fine or a small sentence. But Boston had other plans. As he stood before Judge Haywood Berry, Boston wasn't just there to listen passively or to plead his case. He was on a mission to make a statement, and what better way to do that than by lighting up a joint right there in the courtroom? Boston, representing himself, took the opportunity to tell the court that he thought marijuana laws were unfair. He argued that marijuana was a harmless drug and had been around forever, going so far as to say, "We the people deserve better." Now, voicing his opinion on the matter was one thing, but what he did next took things to a whole new level. As Judge Berry tried to get the hearing back on track, Boston reached into his jacket, pulled out a joint, and calmly lit it up, right there in front of the judge, courtroom officers, and everyone else present. For a few moments, no one could believe what was happening. Then the officers realized Boston had actually lit a joint in the middle of court. They quickly rushed to restrain him and put an end to his bold protest. The judge, while not unsympathetic to the argument about marijuana laws, wasn't about to let this slide. Boston was charged with contempt of court and disorderly conduct, adding extra charges on top of his original possession charge. As if that wasn't enough, Boston later gave an interview, bragging about how he managed to sneak the joint into court by taping it to his chest. It was bold, outrageous, and definitely unforgettable. Unfortunately for Boston, his protest didn't lead to the kind of marijuana reform he was hoping for. Instead, it led to an additional sentence: 10 days in jail for contempt, along with a $3,000 bond. Case number 7. Alan McCarty's threats against the judge. If there's one thing that's sure to escalate your legal troubles, it's threatening a judge, and Alan McCarty learned that the hard way. McCarty found himself in court over a contentious child custody battle with his ex-wife. He was already angry, feeling like the legal system was against him. But rather than handle his frustrations through proper legal channels, McCarty took a dangerous and reckless path. In his mind, Judge Stachio Warren was the person responsible for all his problems, and McCarty wasn't about to let that slide. One day, McCarty decided to call the Volusia County Sheriff's Office in Florida, and he didn't hold back. He ranted about how the judge was keeping his kids from him and made a chilling threat. He claimed to have a gun pointed at the courthouse and said he was ready to kill Judge Warren. The exact words? He threatened to execute that son of a expletive right in the street. It was the kind of call that no one could ignore. The authorities quickly tracked McCarty down and arrested him, charging him with making a threat against a sitting judge. But his outrageous behavior didn't stop there. In court, McCarty's fury spilled over. From the moment he walked into the courtroom for his pretrial hearing, it was clear that things were going to get heated. He hurled insults at the court, refused to raise his right hand when asked to take an oath, and made it clear he wasn't interested in cooperating. As the hearing progressed, McCarty continued to hurl expletives and insults at Judge Foxman, even refusing to testify or answer questions. His outbursts were so frequent and disruptive that the judge eventually ordered him to be removed from the courtroom. McCarty was placed in a separate room where he could hear the trial through a speaker and watch the proceedings through a one-way mirror. But even in isolation, His violent threats and insults didn't let up. In the end, McCarty's behavior led to a hefty sentence. He was given 20 years in prison for threatening the judge, with an additional 10 days for his courtroom outbursts. What's ironic is that the judge McCarty threatened wasn't even the one responsible for the child custody decision he was so upset about. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.